We are in Genesis chapter 2. Remember, we talked about verse 19 and following that in the creation, the Lord God had formed, and notice this is in verse 19, out of the ground, all the beasts of the field and the birds of the air. And he brought them to Adam to see what he would name them. And it's interesting because God also creates man out of the dust of the ground. So in that sense, God used the same material, basic material, to create birds, all the living creatures and things, but he also made man. But we found out that there's something unique about God's creation of humanity that is not said about the rest of the creation. What does God do to man that it doesn't say that he did, to the rest of creation? I had a Hebrew professor, he said, the way this is worded in the Hebrew, it leaves a tone of excitement. And I'm like, oh, okay. So it's hard to leave that in the English translation unless you went something like woohoo. And if that had been put in our English translations, we'd have really laughed over that. But this is now bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. He shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Now, it's for this reason. Now, this is kind of cool because he's going to give a reason to this. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife. They will become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. Isn't it interesting that in this pristine paradise, at this point, there's no shame attached to nakedness? Now, we're going to see in a little while when that changes. A specific incident happens when that whole thing changes. But just kind of keep that in mind. And you'll remember when we get there in Genesis. Over this, it's interesting that you have the creation account in chapter 1. And then chapter 2, he still goes into the creation, but with different perspectives and more emphasis on Adam as a man being created, and then the need for Eve to be created, and Adam naming what's been created. So chapter 2 is a real interesting expansion on just what I would call a bare framework of creation in chapter 1. Chapter 2 really expands on that. Any comments or questions on the creation? I know there's a million that we could ask, but chapter 1 and 2 lays the foundation for understanding the beginnings of humanity and the world itself. And it's interesting that this occasion is used here in Genesis 2 to talk about God's plan for marriage, and yet Adam and Eve didn't have a father and mother. So they're the progenitors, they're the first ones, but based on they're being created for each other, it gives you the purpose for husband and wife. And from that point onward, God's intention is that you leave home and begin your own. So this is the divine plan of where it gets started. Even in the ancient world, there were so many negative attitudes about women. So much so that some of the rabbis would pray, Lord, I thank you, I'm not a woman. That was part of their rabbinic prayer. And sadly, it really distorts God's vision. Because as far as God is concerned, male and female are equal in value. It's always been that way from the beginning. It's just that they have a different role. Christianity also threatened the culture in which it took hold, especially all around the Greco-Roman Empire, precisely because they heard in the Christian message that women were to be treated of equal value as men. And the patriarchal society, ancient society, didn't believe that. And so Christianity came along and gave women an equal sense of value and participation. What really seemed to scandalize a lot of the Greco-Roman cities was in the early church when women prophesied. That was unusual. Or even being in the same assembly with men. If we were studying in First Timothy, where Paul talks about if women are in an assembly to be silent, there was the recognition that they were kind of walking a tightrope here. One is we want to make sure that women know they're of equal value. And that was threatening the culture. At the same time, though, you didn't want women violating even some basic rules of culture, because that would negate the opportunity for people to hear the gospel. Paul, remember when we went through 1 Corinthians, we had a whole list of those, where Paul is, what's the phrase people use? Paul was very missiological in his perspective. He was always concerned about, is this going to keep people from hearing the gospel? And that was always important to Paul. That's why he said, what's the phrase? We do all things to win some. Okay, so he was flexible in some of the things that he did. In this particular issue, in Genesis, it lays the foundation for women being equal in value to men. And though there are different roles, for example, mother and father, different roles, but equal in value. I mean, there's no way under the sun that you can devalue a mother or a wife. That's a God-given role. And the father or husband, in a sense, is really no more important, than the wife or the mother. But each has a role, and as God lays it out, they need each other. That's why I love this phrase. See, there was no one suitable as a helper found for Adam. Okay? So what God does is he creates this suitable helper. What does the King James say? It says a help me. And people, the word meet is an old English word that is an adjective, which means suitable. So it's a helper that's suitable. And so what we would do sometimes, and the phrase a helpmate. Well, people would take the expression help meet, use it like you would use helpmate, which is really incorrect, because the word meet describes a helper, but a helper that's suitable for Adam. Now think about this. God knew exactly what Adam needed. Okay? And the thing that we have to remember is that no matter what your role, everybody in the church is of equal value. Think about how for years we highlighted the role of the preacher. He was more important than anybody else in the church. Well, no, the Bible never says that, but we treated him like that. So I love this idea of thinking that from the very beginning, with Adam needing a helper suitable for him, God knew what he needed. And at that point also establishes the way that God anticipates both man and woman leaving father and mother and beginning a marriage. So this is where all this gets started. That's part of what's been misunderstood. Throughout history, people felt like that it basically was saying men were more important than women. Yeah. Now, when you look at Ephesians 5, let's turn over here. This is really cool. And I didn't know this for years, so you got to hear this. Over in Ephesians 5, because too many people feel like, well, that historically the problem is that, well, if it's a hierarchy, then I've got control over the woman because I'm a man. She's not as, valuable as I am. All kinds of distorted thoughts through the centuries have come just because of misreading what that really entails. Because I would say that this is the other side of the coin that often gets left out. In Ephesians 5, if your study Bible is like mine, at the top of the paragraph, verse 22, it says wives and husbands. Some of you may have a title there. What's interesting when you translate verse 22, notice it says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord. In the Greek language, there's no verb submit in verse 22. When you translate it, you have to insert it. Guess where the verb is? It's up in verse 21. I would prefer that study Bibles have the title wives and husbands over the top of verse 21, not 22. Because look how this starts off. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That is the key issue. And so when a husband, as Paul says, treats his wife like Christ treats the church, guess what? She's going to be willing to submit to her husband. That's the condition. And submission is not beaten on. That's not what Paul means here. Submission is not abusing them. Submission is not thinking they're second class. It's none of that. And unfortunately, there have been throughout history forms of Christian teaching, Barbara, that has led to people abusing, misunderstanding, and devaluing women. And that's sad. But that is never what God intended. And we just need to realize that the relationship that God created between husband and wife is one of mutual submission. That's what he says here, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's part of why he got in so much trouble. Think about, how did he treat the woman at the well? So what you find is Jesus being very controversial, even in his ministry, of how he tried to elevate the value of women. Because a lot of people in culture didn't appreciate it. Adam and Eve, but think about it this way. If she is suitable for him, then he's suitable also for her. See, that goes both ways. You got to remember that. Okay, now we into chapter 3. We're starting to get into the whole thing of where Satan enters the picture. Up until now, in chapter 1 and 2 in Genesis, as one Bible teacher said, everything's hunky-dory. But oh my, we get to chapter 3, the whole thing changes. So let's look at it. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God has made. So I think we were ending there last week, if I remember on this word. Tell me what you think it means for the serpent to be described as crafty. I think the King James says he was more subtle than any other beast in the field. Crafty, subtle, whatever, however we want to understand this word, watch how the serpent works with Adam and Eve. Mm-hmm. So we're gonna get an insight into this word when we watch how he functions here in chapter 3. It's pictured as Satan being embodied this way. I think of it a lot like in the Gospels where Jesus was baptized. The Spirit, came down in the form of a dove. So you have a spiritual being in a physical form. It's the same thing here with Satan. Spiritual being, he's in a physical form. And think about what's being emphasized here. How Satan, being crafty and subtle, watch how he's going to approach Eve, and watch how he operates through her to get to Adam. And you get an insight. In fact, one of the things that you probably need to ask as we're going through this story with Satan is, what is he up to and how does he operate? Where is he most successful with people? And why was he so successful with Adam and Eve here? See, it's those kind of questions we need to ask as we're going through the story, because those are really important. Especially if, remember when we talked about, we opened up the study in Genesis, so many of the stories in Genesis are such that they're designed for you to sit back and reflect on them for a minute and ask questions like, now what's going on? You know, what's the point? How does this tie to the ongoing flow of the narrative of Genesis? But also, what can we learn for our generation today? What's going on here? And what can I learn from it? So the serpent said to the woman, now I think this is kind of interesting too. She doesn't seem surprised that the serpent's talking to her. At least there's no reference like, well, what are you doing talking to him? He said to the woman, did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Now let's stop there with that question. What is he doing with this initial question, do you think? It's kind of the way we use the word really. Did that really happen? Did you really mean that? You know? So that's right. He's starting to put this doubt in her. And this is important because guess what? What is he getting at the heart of? See, let's think a moment. With this question, what is he trying to destroy in her mind? Guess what he's trying to undermine? God's authority for her life. If he can get her to question God's authority and that he really didn't mean what he said, he's been successful. He's also recognizing if he can take the message and twist it just a little. And this is what's interesting. Let's watch, and we're going to see how he throws doubt in her mind, twisting the message that God gave just a little bit. Let me give you a verse in 1 Corinthians 10 that's for those of us who are Christians today. Let's see if it might help us with your question. Paul says God has made a way with every temptation, that there's a way of escape. And there's no temptation common to man, but what we could say, well, I'm unique. No. Temptation is across humanity, but God has made a way of escape that you may be able to bear it, Paul said. Because you would think that perhaps God would have warned them and prepared them ahead of time, maybe. We don't know what preparation God may have given them before this moment of temptation. And you would think if God is loving and good and caring and all the good adjectives that we've already attached to God, you would think that he has equipped them. And see, if he has, then they really blew it. For sure, one of the things that we do know, he gave them the ability to make a choice.
Well, of course, they knew what God said.
Yeah.
They should have obeyed God.
And so what we're going to see is they're exercising their choice in the wrong direction. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? He has twisted already what God said, and he gets Eve to respond to him. And he's doing this on purpose to correct what he has said, because he wants to come back and help her see that God really didn't tell her the whole picture. So, I mean, it's interesting, his rhetorical style and what his goal is and what he's up to. Boy, you talk about crafty, he really is. If we're not careful, all of us have our weak moments, and Satan is able to use his logic on us. If we're not careful, that gets us to make the wrong choice like Adam and Eve did. So we have the same issue they did.